Okay, good afternoon to you all there in TV land on the YouTube. Howdy. So once again, for now I'm going to continue calling this spiritual judo for Jesus, but it is part of the process of upgrading this to a progressive Christianity presentation and series, and addressing various subjects, promoting basically my multidisciplinary philosophy that I've realized is also now working as multidisciplinary theology for Jesus' legacy and integrity. That all provides the intellectual and scholarly philosophical foundation to deal with the appropriate classification of science, the mistaken and the misguided use of science by scientific materialists, these sort of new atheists, ideological new atheists, along with religious fundamentalists and secular materialism in general, along with some of the distinctions of the secular materialism of many progressive Christians as well. So right now, today, the subject I want to get to is, I was just watching the debate on religion and politics that goes back to 2007 between Sam Harris and Harris-Hedges. I've been looking at some of their more recent material, and see that not much has changed in their points of view. And so particularly my focus is on Sam Harris here, to sort of, after I had sort of taken some time away from him and it came back, I realized that I was feeling a little bit intimidated by Sam Harris of 2007. But then giving my attention to him and using, and now already having spent a few years now developing my multidisciplinary philosophy and theology, I began to realize that, Sam Harris is just a comedian. He has a comedy routine and is a pop philosopher. And I looked up his story, and he gained public recognition on the basis of what? On the basis of his popular book called The End of Faith. And the guy hadn't even completed his bachelor's degree. He was at Stanford, but he had interrupted his studies, went to Nepal or India, Asia, to that part of Asia, to do some kind of seeking. But in relation to, say, Richie Ram Das and Vandana Shiva and simply Buddhism in general, Buddhists like the Dalai Lama, this Sam Harris was just showing himself to be just a really, it really comes down to a question of integrity and scholarly integrity, just which is something I'm cultivating and developing into, using to recognize the absence, the absence of a necessary framework that I'm calling simply, in simple terms, really, and really, how do you say, sort of cardboard terms. It's unglamorous, but it is really the nuts and bolts term, multidisciplinary philosophy, to elevate basically what was my background: liberal arts, biological anthropology. I got a science degree that's called a Bachelor of Arts, or an AB at Harvard, but that in which I used my biological focus and their program, to study symbolic behavior and the evolution of language, and that gives me a foundation that apparently is quite uncommon and exceptional in these discussions of science and religion. I mean, I look at John Lennox and really Alistair McGrath has been getting even really quite close to the relevant framework of issues, talking about the role of theory, the meaning of theory for science and natural theology, but simply not getting at this necessary framework for scholarship and intellectual scholarship and philosophical scholarship in talking about these issues, and they're drawing on the interdisciplinary resources of the university-based academia. So, Sam Harris, in this 2007 presentation, Sam Harris shows his comedic orientation. At least he's a pop philosopher drawing on comedic sensibilities. And so he tries to disarm people by showing awareness which seems to be, by showing awareness of the subject, as if that disarming or an attempt to disarm actually serves or is the same as legitimate intellectual argument and establishing a clear and honest framework with integrity. So he says he doesn't want me to be derogatory about religion, and his point is not to offend. And then he uses this phraseology that simply reflects his category errors, his basic category errors, and what becomes an ad hominem fallacy, that faith-based religion is the most dangerous ideology ever invented, based on 9/11. So he's confusing fundamentalist denominations, fundamentalist individuals and approaches with all denominational and all approaches, all group approaches and individual and group approaches to religion, without identifying it with any clarity. In this case, he's talking with Chris Hedges, who has his own slightly idiosyncratic perspective, but very well grounded in general, who talks about then monotheism and tribalism. But the terms that I might suggest already at this point, in terms of understanding religion, is that, well, I'm forgetting the scholar now, but maybe it's William James or one of these guys, Huston Smith perhaps, or Ninian Smart, who points out that all religion, all organizations, all groups that identify as a certain religion have their origin in the spiritual religious experience of at least one individual, and then their development to various individuals along the way in a historical process and sociological process. And so I've been identifying my own perspective based on biological anthropology and the work of a lot of credit I have to give to Elliot Chappell, who was a behavioral biological anthropologist who wrote Principles of Anthropology in 1942, and then a later more technical version in a book called Individuality and the Biology and Culture of Individuality, biological, something of that sort. and I think that was more in 1967, that second book. But I've identified the more religious, technical religious perspective might be from like Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, I believe, from I think the 1700s, the 18th century, who, as part of the German critical biblical perspective, identified religion as an intuition relating an individual to the universe. And then I've noted at a site I was given the reference to Tolstoy, a science site called Space in Motion, I believe it is. Jeffrey, I'll have to look up his name again. But he's got some interesting insights in physics, and he's certainly making a lot of attempts to bridge, in his scientific materialism, I guess, basically, to expand science as much as possible into metaphysics. And so he quotes Tolstoy, who had this very insightful definition that religion is an individual's relationship to the universe, and which I find very useful in an anthropological sense, and a biological anthropological sense, without getting much more into it. And then there are the people Rudolf Otto and Elias Myriad, who are interesting to also look at in that respect in addition. So, those are people that would give us more of a sound, scholarly, balanced, objective kind of, an empirical, really, is what we're getting at here. That as part of my perspective in multidisciplinary philosophy, we need to recognize the role of empirical methodology as the source of scientific philosophies, i.e. science, and its specific development of the scientific method as a manifestation of the more general and valuable process, more generally valuable process of empiricism, which then would represent the observational process of how, like, sociology, psychology developed in defining their terms, their description, but in entering into the social realm, which then brings us to the need of understanding anti-positivism and interpretivism, which I'm not seeing done with any clarity in these kind of debates. Right? Because we don't apply the scientific method strictly to human subjects, to human people. We don't do that for ethical reasons, for moral reasons, but it's also for scholarly reasons, because symbolic behavior involves norms and values that requires understanding, and that's a perspective that anthropology, sociology, and psychology get at much with adequate and appropriate understanding, and their epistemologies, right? Also the upgrading of the term epistemology or applying, right? Creating this applied form of the term epistemology to understand these knowledge domains of the phenomena domains involved. So, a lot of material there. Hope you're still with me. Either way, let's keep going here. 3 ways of defending God. So Sam Harris then has his trademark way of summing things up and classifying, creating classifications. That religion is true, useful, or involves attacks on atheism as intolerant, and he tries to use these the identification of these categories as ways to disarm the points of religion in discussing religion. So, but he basically, in thinking that he can do that, he first turns most of his focus to that to the kind of mockery style method to try to mock the fact that religions claim to be true. And so he gets into the sort of the scientific materialist, superficial, specious categorizing through it's really a form of ridicule in terms of offering arguments that, well, they can't all be true, and sort of using this presuppositionalism. That's what that is, right? It's presuppositionalism. The question is not what to presuppose that they can't all be true. The question is to presuppose, well, what do they represent? What is there that is legitimate in what they represent? So we have no discussion, we have no identification, no acknowledgement of actual scientific studies of basic behaviors like meditation and prayer that have psychological benefits, right? In comparative religious studies, we can start with that kind of observation. That spiritual religious experience can involve visions and visionary experience, and that's related to meditative practice and the brain states that are represented by brain scans, involving also alpha, delta type brain activity, if we get into the neuroscience of it. And then he goes on with his commentary that we should, I guess he's quoting Bertrand Russell when he says, well, they can't all be true, so we should all expect damnation because, in the case of, say, Islam, we don't believe in Allah, and we're not following Islam, and so we should expect damnation by their some stereotyping of their expectations, right? There's no quote offered, there's no specifics offered, even for just that level of credibility, but it's sort of this presupposition that to disqualify the validity, disqualify the legitimacy, is basically his perspective, which is not a scholarly approach. It is a bigoted approach. It is a presuppositionalist approach, to put it in most kind of academic terms. So let's see here. And then he gets to Christianity. He says that evidence for religion is non-existent, which is such a it's such a common phrase that is used. I was just looking at another video that also drew on that same phrase. It is a mantra. It is a, what are we talking about here? It is a presupposition that they use, which is simply untrue. It's now, how is it untrue? Well, we can quickly refer to what? My favorite baseline spiritual religious experience is transpersonal psychosomatic medicine. We have evidence of medically attested, medically impossible or medically improbable healings. Now, I have a whole range of reports and phenomena that I've been drawing on. Christian Science, It's a Miracle, the TV show by Questar Entertainment, is full of diverse examples. Christian Science itself as a church, but the Catholic Church with its Lourdes clinic and then its canonization proceedings have been rigorous for decades upon decades. As medical science was developing back in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, the Catholic Church was already on it. And all of that's very interesting to examine. So, I have a particular favorite reference in Marlene Clapey's whose video is available on the internet, perhaps there's some written material, in which she gives her testimony of having cerebral palsy, which is this brain damage from childhood, from basically infancy. That's is probably very familiar to many of you and many of us, and it's brain damage is what it is. It's at a young age that has interfered with the muscular coordination of a person. And so there she was. She was afflicted with this, and was at the age of 20 was taken to the Mayo Clinic, where they noted her suffering and spasms, the muscle spasms, and the kinds of movement that she would do. And so she had become a Christian more or less, basically conscientiously at 12 years old. And then in those 8 years, at this point at 20 then, she was praying, and at the clinic, at the Mayo Clinic, got a response, right? So it's an interesting coincidence. It's an interesting convergence of events in her life and context. And so in a sequence involving what? Her prayer, a vision, a second vision, the search for a church, and contact with the pastor and the church, and then the healing, her being picked up by the pastor and experiencing the healing in the church, returning in something that is simply medically impossible. Healing of cerebral palsy in association with a spiritual religious testimony that goes along with various spiritual religious experiences. So wonderful example there. But then there are also the wonderful examples of, well, there's also Bill Owens I like to refer to, who is from the It's a Miracle Questar Entertainment body of records. An Episcopalian who was suffering liver failure, who had suffered on a hike, was taken to a Florida hospital. He had suffered with his son, was taken to a Florida hospital, and they portray on the It's a Miracle episode he's being diagnosed as without hope unless there was a liver transplant. And so his Episcopal priest, organized a healing prayer circle around his hospital bed. That was followed by his healing. So, nice. So I guess psychosomatics, the placebo effect, is often the label, and I guess there's spontaneous remission is this other label that's used. And so we have to be clear that these labels are simply inadequate. Given we have other examples of how the placebo effect, has can have various limitations. There's a story about a guy who was miraculously healed in a way that was engineered. What is the story? The tumors melted like snowballs. It was a doctor who actually, it's reported in the New York Times as well, was a doctor in 1959 or so who schemed to use a placebo effect strategy with this patient, and was able to demonstrate this miraculously successful result. But it also became this convergence of phenomena in which Crebiotin or something. It was some substance, perhaps was it a horse medicine type of substance, that Crebiotin, I think, that was then, it was invalidated in the news and publicly, in the media. And so the patient heard it, and then the tumors returned in full. The doctor noted that. And so he tried another maneuver to persist in the ruse, the psychosomatic, the placebo effect ruse, that was also successful in showing further this convergence of phenomena. And then yet another report came out that the patient also saw and then listened to and was affected by, that caused his tumors to return, that is associated with the return of his tumors and then his death, sadly and tragically. But it shows, that kind of sequence shows the wonder of that, the way that level, we're talking about different levels of explanation, and that level of phenomena, and that sequence of phenomena was isolated in the psychological kind of level, or psychosocial, a very materialistic, simple level, in contrast to something like Marlene Coppice and Bill Owen and many other testimonies of the kind that involve their spiritual religious practice, and what are we talking about? We're talking about the psychosocial schema, if we use Piaget's terminology, the depth of schema that involve their own experiential level, but that also ties them historically to a whole sociological experience of Christian society, Christian civilization, and its history, its historical roots. And the shared phenomena, the multiple examples, multiple cases of similar phenomena, right? And then that brings us to Craig Keener's 2011 work, in which he gets into the problem of the presumption, the scientific presuppositionalism of David Hume, who had this bifurcated fallacies, in which he asserted against the legitimacy of cause and effect association, and the legitimacy of miracles. So, very interesting, important work by Craig Keener. And so this is Sam Harris. I'll stop for this version, this part.